The encounter. The late morning sun poured through the glass windows of Daniel Ward's penthouse office, casting long shadows across the sleek, modern furniture. From his position by the floor-to-ceiling windows, he could see the bustling city of New York unfolding beneath him, each person on the street seemingly unaware of his watchful gaze. The city had always been his kingdom, its lights and concrete structures a testament to the empire he had built with his own two hands. His steel-gray eyes, as sharp and cold as the buildings he oversaw, took in the view with a sense of quiet satisfaction. Behind him, the hum of his office phone echoed off the marble walls, a sharp reminder that there was always work to be done. His assistant, Natalie, moved briskly around the office, her heels clicking against the polished floor as she shuffled through documents. Every detail of the office, every arrangement, every movement was perfectly orchestrated, just as Daniel had trained his life to be. "Mr. Ward," Natalie called out, her voice breaking through his moment of solitude, "about the Thompson factory closure." Daniel didn't turn away from the window. "What about it?" Her tone was measured, but there was an edge of frustration that he didn't miss. "The workers' union has sent another proposal. They're willing to take a pay cut if we keep the factory open." He turned slowly, his eyes narrowing. "You know my stance on this, Natalie. It's not about pay cuts or morale. We're shutting it down. Let them figure out their next move." The words left his mouth with an air of finality, and Natalie, who had been working with him for years, knew better than to press him further. Still, there was a sense of quiet resignation in her voice as she handed him the paperwork. "They're also asking to meet with you, sir. Some of the workers are desperate." Daniel waved her off. "I'm done with them. I've made my decision. Now, get those contracts finalized." Before Natalie could leave, she paused, looking as though she wanted to say something else. There was an almost imperceptible hesitation in her posture, a subtle but noticeable shift. Daniel's sharp eyes caught it, and he raised an eyebrow. "What is it?" he asked, his voice clipped. "There's someone here to see you," Natalie said carefully. "A girl, actually." "A girl?" His brows furrowed in confusion. "I don't have time for visitors today, especially not some random girl." "She says it's important," Natalie replied. "She's insistent. She won't leave." Daniel's patience thinned. He didn't have time for distractions. He was a CEO, he controlled his schedule down to the smallest detail, and everything in his world revolved around efficiency and power. A girl on the other side of his office door didn't fit into that equation. "Send her away." "I'm not in the mood for charity work," he snapped, his voice cold as he turned back toward the window. But then Natalie spoke again, this time more urgently. "Mr. Ward, she's outside the building. She says she has a warning. She says you're in danger." Daniel stopped mid-step, his hand frozen in place as he reached for a glass of water on the side of his desk. A warning? From a girl? He had dealt with threats and corporate espionage, but this? This felt different. He wasn't superstitious or inclined to believe in coincidence, but something about her persistence intrigued him. "Fine. Bring her in," he said, his tone reluctant. A few moments later, the door to his office opened, and Natalie ushered in a young girl. She was no older than 16, perhaps even younger, with messy brown hair that hung in tangled waves around her face. Her clothes were worn, mismatched, and faded, but it was her eyes that caught his attention, the bright, almost wild intensity in them that seemed to see right through him. She didn't belong here, in his pristine, corporate world. She walked in without hesitation, her small frame radiating confidence, even though everything about her appearance screamed that she had lived a life of hardship. As she stepped forward, Daniel could feel her gaze burning into him, her eyes unflinching. "Mr. Ward," she said, her voice soft but firm, "thank you for letting me speak with you." He blinked, momentarily caught off guard by the calmness in her voice. What is it you want, young lady? He crossed his arms, adopting a defensive posture as he sized her up. I don't want anything from you, she replied quickly, her gaze unwavering. Not money, not your company, not even a home. She paused, as if gathering the courage to say something much more important. I'm here because I need to save your life. Daniel narrowed his eyes, the skepticism creeping into his voice. Save my life? I'm perfectly fine, thank you. The girl took a step closer, her eyes intense. You're not fine. And you don't even realize it. There was something about her tone, calm yet insistent, that stirred something in him. Daniel, a man who prided himself on his ability to control every situation, suddenly felt a flicker of unease. He leaned forward, his gaze sharpening. Explain yourself, he demanded. Before she could respond, there was a loud bang from the floor below. It was the sound of something heavy crashing through the building, followed by the unmistakable screech of metal on concrete. It wasn't a normal sound for this part of the building, and for a split second, everything in the room seemed to freeze. Then came the second, more violent sound, the impact, a horrific thud, followed by the vibration of the entire building shaking from the shock. Daniel's heart raced, and he turned instinctively toward the window. What had just happened? Was it an accident? The building had never felt so unstable before. In a flash, the girl, this seemingly ordinary, homeless girl, moved forward with an unexpected swiftness. She grabbed his arm with surprising strength, yanking him away from the window as another gust of wind slammed against the glass. For a brief moment, Daniel couldn't comprehend what was happening. The girl had saved him. She had physically pulled him back just in time, preventing him from being in the direct line of whatever had just happened. Get down, she shouted, as debris and glass shattered around them, falling to the floor in a deadly cascade. But Daniel, his heart still racing, couldn't stop himself from staring at her. You, his voice was low, barely audible. How did you know? How could you have possibly known? She looked at him, her expression softening just slightly, but there was something resigned in her eyes. Because I've been watching. Because I know what's coming. The building had just shaken, and the very ground beneath him felt uncertain. Daniel's mind was racing, trying to piece together what had just occurred. Who had tried to harm him? Why? But all he could focus on was the girl's steady, unwavering gaze. How had she saved him? And why had she asked for nothing in return? Her voice cut through his swirling thoughts. I didn't come here to ask for money. I didn't come here for your charity. I came because there's one thing I need from you. He was still reeling from the shock of nearly losing his life, and her words took him completely by surprise. And what's that? He asked, his voice still shaky from the adrenaline. She swallowed hard, as if the next words were difficult to say. I need you to be my dad. Daniel felt a strange weight in the pit of his stomach, and for the first time in his life, he was at a loss for words. Your dad? His voice was barely above a whisper, incredulous. She nodded, her eyes never leaving his. I need a father. And I'm asking you, Daniel Ward, will you be the father I've never had? For a long moment, the room was still. The sounds of the building's aftermath faded into the background as Daniel grappled with what had just been asked of him. He had no idea who this girl was, or what she was truly seeking, but there was something in her eyes, a kind of raw vulnerability, that shook him to his core. I don't know how to be a father, he finally said, his voice hoarse with emotion he couldn't quite understand. I've spent my whole life building this empire, but I don't know how to be what you need. Lena, he had learned her name in that brief exchange, looked at him with something like hope in her eyes. I don't need you to be perfect, she said quietly. I just need someone who's there. Someone who won't leave. And in that moment, as the dust settled and the city continued to buzz with life below, Daniel realized that he wasn't sure he could walk away from this girl, this stranger who had saved him in the most unlikeliest of circumstances. Could he really be the father she so desperately needed? And if he said yes, could he face the truths about himself that had been buried for so long? For the first time in years, Daniel didn't know what the next step was. But somehow, he knew this moment would change everything, unraveling secrets. The aftermath of the explosion reverberated through Daniel's bones, the shock of nearly losing his life still fresh in his mind. His office, once pristine and perfect, was now in chaos, with broken glass scattered across the floor and dust settling in the corners. But even amidst the wreckage, the girl, Lena, stood unwavering, her presence calm as the storm raged in Daniel's mind. She had saved him. His fingers still trembled as he reached for the glass of water on his desk, his hand unsteady. As he brought it to his lips, he couldn't take his eyes off her. She had spoken with such certainty, pulling him away from the window just in time. What was she? Some kind of fortune-teller? Or was there something deeper, something he couldn't quite put his finger on? Lena, for her part, didn't seem fazed by the destruction around them. She merely stepped to the side, picking up a piece of broken glass from the floor as if it were nothing. It was as though she had been through this kind of chaos before. Daniel lowered his glass, his heart still racing. How did you know that was going to happen? Lena looked up at him, her brown eyes holding an intensity that felt like a piercing gaze into his very soul. I didn't know, exactly. But I've been following the patterns. Someone's been trying to get to you, Mr. Ward. Someone? Daniel's voice hardened, suspicion creeping in. He had built his empire through power and control, and anyone who dared to threaten him would meet a swift end. Who? I can't say for sure, but it's been building for a while. I just didn't know when it would happen. I could feel it getting closer. Her voice was steady, though there was a hint of something darker in her words. Daniel's mind was racing, but he knew better than to get lost in his thoughts now. He had to focus. He needed answers, and Lena was the only person who seemed to know something about what had just transpired. You're saying someone wants me dead? Daniel asked, stepping toward her, his voice edged with a mixture of disbelief and anger. Lena nodded, her face solemn. Yes. But it's not just that. They want to destroy everything you've built, everything you hold dear. This was just the beginning. Daniel's chest tightened at her words. He had built his empire from the ground up, his sweat, blood, and tears poured into every corner of his company. To think that someone was out there plotting against him. It sent a chill down his spine. But more than that, there was something about Lena's tone, something unsettling, that made him question everything he thought he knew. You said you've been following patterns, Daniel said, his voice growing colder. How do you know all of this? Lena hesitated for a moment, her gaze flickering downward before meeting his eyes once more. I wasn't always homeless, Mr. Ward. I had a life before all this. Daniel's brow furrowed in confusion. You're not homeless? Lena gave a faint, almost sad smile. Not by choice. But that's a long story, one I don't think you're ready to hear just yet. The words hung in the air, heavy with unspoken truths, and for a brief moment, Daniel felt a pang of guilt. He had spent his life chasing wealth, power, control, things he had always believed were the keys to happiness. But standing here in front of him was a girl who had somehow managed to stay grounded in the face of everything she'd endured. She had saved his life, yet she had asked for nothing in return but something far more precious, something that no amount of money could buy. Tell me more, Daniel said, his voice softer now. About you. About your life. Lena glanced around the room, her fingers tracing the edge of a broken chair as she seemed to weigh the decision to speak. After a long moment, she sighed, her shoulders slumping. I used to have everything. A family. A home. A future. But that all changed when I was just a little girl. My father. He was someone like you, Mr. Ward. Powerful. Rich. But he wasn't a good man. Not at all. He was selfish, greedy, and he pushed my mother to the edge. Daniel stiffened at the mention of her father. It was almost as if she was describing him. He'd never been the best father figure, he was too focused on his work, too driven by ambition. His personal life had always been a distant second priority, and it showed in the strained relationships he had with those closest to him. Lena continued, her voice shaking slightly as she spoke of her past. When my mother tried to leave him, he did everything he could to make sure we stayed under his thumb. I spent years in foster homes, moving from one to the next, always wondering if I would ever find a place where I truly belonged. My father, he never once looked for me. Never once reached out. Daniel felt something stir inside him. A strange empathy, perhaps, mixed with guilt. For the first time, he found himself questioning his own choices, his own priorities. Your father sounds like a monster, Daniel said quietly. Lena's lips twitched into something that could almost be called a smile. He wasn't always that way. There was a time when he cared. But then, something changed. Something broke inside of him, and he became what he is today. Daniel's mind reeled. He had heard stories of people who had lost their way, who had let their power consume them, but hearing it from her, someone who had been on the receiving end of that selfishness, struck him like a punch to the gut. He had spent years striving for success, thinking it would make him happy. But now, he saw how hollow that pursuit really was. You don't know what it's like to grow up without a father, Lena continued, her voice steady. To go through life wondering why your father didn't care enough to even look for you. That kind of pain never leaves. It follows you, even when you think you've moved on. Daniel swallowed, his throat tight. So, you came here because you want me to be your father? He wasn't sure whether the question was for confirmation or to make sense of the absurdity of it all. Lena nodded. I've never had a father. I've never had someone to protect me, to guide me, to help me when I needed it the most. I've had to fend for myself all these years, but I can't keep going like this. I need someone who can show me that not all men are like my father. That there's still good in the world. Daniel's heart was heavy with the weight of her words. She was asking for something he wasn't sure he could give. He had never been the type to offer unconditional love or support. It wasn't in him to be vulnerable, to show weakness. He had built walls around his emotions, keeping everyone at arm's length. But now, this girl, this stranger, had shattered those walls with a single request. She had asked for something he had never given to anyone before. She was asking him to be a father. He ran a hand through his hair, his mind racing. I don't know if I can do that, Lena. I don't know how to be a father. I've never known how. Lena's gaze softened, and for a moment, there was a flicker of something hopeful in her eyes. I don't need you to be perfect, Mr. Ward. I just need you to be here. To show me that I'm not alone. That I can have a family. That I can have a future. Her words echoed in his mind, reverberating in his chest like a beating heart. Daniel felt the walls around him starting to crack. The life he had built, the empire he had poured himself into, suddenly felt insignificant in the face of her raw need. You've asked me for something I don't know how to give, Daniel said quietly, his voice thick with emotion. But I'll try. I'll try for you, Lena. Her face softened, and for the first time in years, Daniel felt something warm stir within him, a feeling he hadn't felt in so long. Perhaps it was hope. Or maybe, just maybe, it was the beginning of something more. Something neither of them had expected. And in that moment, amidst the wreckage of the explosion, amidst the shattered glass and chaos, Daniel Ward realized that he might just have found something worth fighting for. The burden of responsibility. The days following the near-fatal explosion passed in a blur of activity, and for once, Daniel Ward was less concerned about the boardroom battles or the empire he had so carefully constructed. The events in his office, the strange girl who had saved his life, and the unexpected request she had made, everything seemed to shift his focus in a way nothing else had in years. His mind was still grappling with the weight of Lena's words. "Be my father." The phrase replayed in his head like a broken record, a reminder that his carefully orchestrated life had just been thrust into uncharted waters. Lena had stayed by his side through the aftermath of the explosion, her presence oddly grounding amid the chaos that had unfolded. Her calm demeanor, her quiet determination, and that fierce, unshakable hope in her eyes, it all confused him, even as it stirred something deep within him that he couldn't explain. How was he supposed to navigate this new reality? How was he supposed to become something he had never been before? A father. He couldn't deny that part of him was terrified at the thought. He had never been good with emotions, and the few relationships he had maintained were shallow at best. He had kept his heart locked away for years, unwilling to risk vulnerability. His father had taught him early on that weakness was something to be avoided at all costs. Power, control, success, those were the things that mattered. And yet, here was this girl, standing before him, asking for the one thing he couldn't give, his heart. Daniel had always been a man of reason, of calculated decisions. He didn't make choices on impulse. But this was different. It felt like fate, or at the very least, an opportunity he could not ignore. He wasn't entirely sure why, but there was something about Lena that called to him. The morning after the explosion, he had arranged for her to stay in one of his company's guest suites, luxurious, secure, and far removed from the chaos of the streets she had known. He made sure she had everything she needed, a comfortable bed, food, clothes. Yet even in the comfort of her new temporary home, Lena hadn't let down her guard. She remained quiet, distant, and strangely detached, as if she was waiting for something. Daniel watched from a distance, his mind running through the possibilities of how to help her. But deep down, he knew he wasn't simply trying to help her, he was trying to heal something inside himself. Something broken that he had buried so deep for so long that he wasn't even sure what it was anymore. That night, after dinner, Lena had finally come to his office again. She hadn't asked for anything more than a simple conversation, but Daniel could see the longing in her eyes. She was searching for something, and it wasn't just a father, it was acceptance, love, and perhaps a future that had eluded her for far too long. "Mr. Ward," Lena said softly, sitting across from him in the leather chair, her fingers twisting nervously around the hem of her sleeve. "I know you're doing this because you feel like you have to. You're not doing it because you want to." Daniel blinked, surprised by the raw honesty in her voice. "What do you mean?" I mean, I know what it's like to be given something out of pity," she continued, her voice steady but tinged with sadness. "I've been given scraps, things people didn't want anymore. I've lived on charity. And I'm not asking for that from you. I don't need your pity, Mr. Ward. I just need to know I'm worth something. To someone." Daniel felt a lump form in his throat. It wasn't pity that had driven him to agree to her request. It was something deeper, something that had been awakened within him the moment he had looked into her eyes. "You're worth more than you think," Daniel said quietly, his voice hoarse. I don't know how to be what you need." Lena's gaze softened, but there was a sharpness to it, as though she could see through his defenses. "You don't have to be perfect. I don't need you to be some idealized version of a father. I just need you to be real with me. To show me that I'm not invisible. That I matter." For a long moment, they sat in silence, the weight of her words hanging heavily between them. Daniel's chest tightened, and a wave of guilt surged within him. How many times had he dismissed people, treated them as nothing more than numbers or transactions? How many times had he shut out the people who had tried to get close to him, afraid that letting them in would weaken him? But Lena wasn't asking for something impossible. She wasn't asking for his money, or his power, or his control. She was asking for something simple, something he had never given anyone before: his time, his attention, his heart. Daniel leaned forward, running a hand through his hair as he processed her words. "I've spent my whole life building walls, Lena. I've kept everyone at a distance because I didn't want to feel anything. I didn't want to be vulnerable." "I know," Lena said softly, her eyes not leaving his. "But you don't have to do this alone, you know. And you don't have to be afraid to open up. I've been alone for so long, but I'm here now. And I'm not going anywhere." For the first time, Daniel felt a crack in the armor he had built around himself. It was a slow, almost imperceptible shift, but it was there. He had spent so long focusing on his empire, his work, his power. But none of that had ever brought him happiness. It had brought him success, yes, but it hadn't brought him peace. It hadn't filled the emptiness inside him that he had tried so hard to ignore. "You don't know what you're asking, Lena," Daniel said quietly. "Being a father isn't easy. It's not just about giving gifts or providing for someone. It's about being there when it counts, about being a steady presence. And I don't know if I can be that person for you." Lena's face softened, and she looked at him with an intensity that made his heart race. "I'm not asking you to be perfect. I just want you to try. I've never had anyone try for me before. And maybe that's all I need. Someone to try." Her words hit him harder than he expected, and Daniel found himself at a crossroads. He had spent so many years chasing success, believing that it was the only thing that mattered. But now, as he looked at Lena, he realized that the one thing he had been missing, love, connection, family, was the very thing that could heal the wounds inside him. For the first time in his life, he wasn't thinking about profits or acquisitions or business strategies. He was thinking about the girl sitting across from him, her eyes filled with hope, her heart open to something he wasn't sure he was capable of offering. But maybe, just maybe, he could learn. Maybe he could try. "I'll try, Lena," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "I'll try to be what you need. I can't promise that I'll get it right. But I'll try." Lena's face lit up with a soft, tentative smile, and in that moment, Daniel realized that he had just made a decision that would change the course of his life forever. He didn't know where this journey would take him, or if he was even capable of being the father she needed. But for the first time in a long time, he felt something that had been missing for years: a flicker of hope, a glimmer of connection, the possibility of redemption. And in the quiet of his office, surrounded by the remnants of a shattered world, Daniel Ward made a vow to himself and to Lena: he would not let her down. He would try to be the father she had never had, even if it meant facing his own demons along the way. It was the beginning of something neither of them could have predicted, but it was a beginning nonetheless: the unseen struggles. The weeks that followed felt like a strange mix of exhaustion and anticipation, as if Daniel Ward had suddenly found himself living in a world that was both familiar and alien. His meetings and responsibilities at work continued, but they no longer consumed him in the way they once had. He still kept his sharp focus on his company, maintaining his position as a powerful CEO, but now, there was a shadow that lingered: Lena. Lena. His daughter? He wasn't sure how to categorize their relationship yet. He had agreed to try, but what did that even mean? He was trying to be something he had never been, and there were moments when the enormity of it all made his head spin. How was he supposed to fulfill her request? How could he give her what she needed when he wasn't even sure he could give it to himself? The cold, controlled world Daniel had spent his life building seemed so far removed from the warmth of family that Lena sought. His father had never been there for him, not in the way a father should be. He had grown up with the knowledge that emotions were a weakness, something to be avoided, ignored, or buried beneath the weight of ambition. And yet, here was Lena, asking him to be something he had never learned how to be. She wanted him to show up, to be present in her life. To be more than a mere figurehead. It wasn't easy. Lena had not come from a life of privilege or wealth. She had been abandoned, neglected, and forced to fend for herself from an early age. Her survival instincts were razor-sharp, and she didn't trust easily, especially not someone like Daniel, who had everything she had never had. It made sense, in a way. Why would she? She had been let down by everyone in her life, from her father to the foster homes that had kept her at arm's length. She was afraid. But so was Daniel. The first time they spent a full day together was a test of patience for both of them. Daniel had invited her to his home for lunch, a lavish, impersonal affair at his penthouse apartment. The space was sleek and cold, filled with the trappings of wealth, art on the walls, polished floors, minimalist furniture, all things Daniel had accumulated through years of careful, calculated decisions. Lena had stood in the doorway, looking hesitant, uncertain. She had grown up in the harshness of the streets, where survival was a daily struggle. The world Daniel inhabited was foreign to her, and she felt a tightness in her chest as she crossed the threshold into his world. "You don't have to stay," Daniel said softly, noticing the discomfort on her face. "We can do this another time." "No," Lena replied, her voice steady but guarded. "I want to try. I don't know if this is what I want, but I'm willing to see." It was the first time she had voiced the uncertainty that had been so palpable between them. And it hit Daniel harder than he expected. He had always been in control, always certain of his next move, but with Lena, he was adrift in uncharted waters. He had no blueprint for how to do this, how to make her feel safe, secure, loved. All he had was his willingness to try. Lunch was awkward, to say the least. The conversation never flowed naturally, and Lena didn't seem interested in the small talk about business, politics, or any of the subjects Daniel was used to. She picked at her food, glancing around the room, as though the very space itself was alien to her. He watched her, noting the way her eyes darted to the door as if she was waiting for something to happen, waiting for the moment when she would have to leave. Daniel cleared his throat, his usual authority struggling to surface. "You don't have to stay here, you know. If it makes you uncomfortable, we can go somewhere else." She shook her head, looking at him with a quiet strength that seemed to resonate deep within him. "It's not about the place. It's me. I don't know how to do this. I don't know how to accept someone like you. I've never had anyone care about me in a way that felt real." The rawness in her voice cut through him like a blade. He wanted to tell her that he was there for her, that he would do whatever it took to prove that she wasn't alone anymore. But he wasn't sure how. He had never had anyone care for him like that, either. His relationship with his own father had been transactional at best, and his mother had always been a distant figure in his life. Emotions, love, affection, they had never been a part of his world. How could he give something he had never known? "I don't know how to show you I care, Lena," he said quietly. "But I will try. I promise." Lena didn't respond immediately. Instead, she stood up, walked to the large windows that overlooked the city, and gazed out at the skyline. The city stretched out before them, vast and unyielding. There was something in her posture, a resignation, a quiet acceptance of the life she had been given. She had never asked for any of it, yet here she was, facing a future that seemed uncertain, a future that Daniel had the power to change. And still, despite all of his wealth, his power, his influence, he found himself powerless when it came to connecting with her in the way she needed. "I don't want your money, Mr. Ward," Lena finally spoke, her voice a little more distant now. "I don't want your charity. I don't want a mansion or fancy clothes. I just want someone who won't leave me. Someone who will stick around long enough to show me that I'm not invisible." Daniel's throat tightened as he heard her words. He had built everything he had on the belief that money and power could shield him from the vulnerabilities that came with love and connection. But with Lena, he saw the truth for the first time: it was never about money. It was never about the things he could buy. It was about being there for someone. It was about presence, not presence. "I won't leave you, Lena," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "I don't know how to be what you want right now, but I will figure it out. I promise I won't give up on you." She turned to look at him, and for the first time, her expression softened. The walls that had been built between them seemed to shift, even if just a little. He could see the flicker of hope in her eyes, a hope she hadn't allowed herself to feel in years. "I don't need you to be perfect," Lena whispered. "I just need you to be real." Daniel nodded, a sense of determination washing over him. He didn't have all the answers, and he didn't have a roadmap for how to be the father she needed. But for the first time, he realized that he didn't have to have it all figured out. All he needed to do was show up. All he needed to do was try. The next few days were no less difficult. As much as Daniel wanted to believe that everything would be okay, the truth was that building a relationship with Lena was never going to be easy. They both had baggage, wounds that had yet to heal, and fears that needed to be faced. But something was shifting. Slowly, but surely, Daniel began to understand what it meant to be there for someone, to put aside his pride, his ambitions, and simply be present in their life. It wasn't going to happen overnight. There would be setbacks, misunderstandings, and moments where they both questioned the path they were on. But Daniel was willing to try. He had promised Lena he would, and for the first time in a long while, he was determined to keep a promise. They both had a long road ahead of them, but maybe, just maybe, they could find something worth holding on to in each other. And as the days passed, Daniel realized that the journey wasn't just about Lena finding a father, it was about him finding something he had never truly allowed himself to experience: connection. The kind that made everything else in life seem insignificant by comparison. In that realization, he understood that he was not just changing her life, he was changing his own. The test of time. As the days turned into weeks, Daniel found himself caught in a delicate balance between the world he had known for so long and the new reality that Lena had unknowingly introduced into his life. The walls that had once defined his existence began to feel suffocating, and though he fought it with every ounce of his being, there was an undeniable pull toward something deeper, something that transcended success, wealth, or power. Lena had slowly become a fixture in his life, but not in the way he had anticipated. At first, he had assumed that his offer to help her would be a temporary arrangement, a charity of sorts, a simple gesture to make him feel better about his privileged existence. But as the days passed, as the laughter they shared became more genuine, as the silences between them began to carry meaning rather than tension, he realized that he was beginning to care for her in ways he couldn't understand. In the beginning, Lena had kept her distance. She didn't want to rely on him, didn't want to let herself believe that he could be trusted. And Daniel understood that. She had been abandoned too many times in her life to simply accept that someone like him, a man who had everything, would want to stick around for her. But slowly, she had started to open up. Little by little, she shared pieces of her past, her pain, her struggle. It wasn't easy for her, and sometimes the stories came out haltingly, in fragmented pieces, but Daniel listened, quietly, intently, with a patience he hadn't known he had. One evening, as they sat together in the quiet of his office, Lena asked him a question that sent a chill down his spine. "Why do you keep doing this?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "Why do you keep trying with me?" Daniel's eyes met hers across the desk, and for a moment, neither of them spoke. The silence stretched between them, heavy with unspoken emotions. What was the answer? Why was he doing this? Was it out of some misplaced sense of duty? Was he just trying to make up for a life he couldn't even begin to understand? "I don't know," Daniel said finally, the words feeling unfamiliar on his tongue. "Maybe it's because I don't want to let you down. I know what it's like to feel invisible, to feel like no one sees you, no one cares. And I don't want that for you. I don't want you to feel like you're alone anymore." Lena's eyes softened, a flicker of something, hope, maybe, shining in their depths. She leaned forward, her elbows resting on the desk, and looked at him with a vulnerability that was both heart-wrenching and beautiful. "You don't have to be perfect, Daniel," she said, her voice steady despite the weight of the words. "I know you're not perfect. None of us are. But I need you to be here. I need you to show me that you care, not because you feel obligated, but because you want to." The simplicity of her request hit him hard. Was it really that simple? Could it really be that easy to just be there? To show up, not as some distant figure, not as the powerful CEO who controlled everything, but as a person, a father, a friend? "I'll try," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "I'll try to be what you need. I promise." Lena didn't smile, but the tension in her shoulders seemed to ease just a little. For the first time, she didn't seem like she was waiting for the other shoe to drop. Maybe, just maybe, she was starting to believe that he wouldn't let her down. Over the next few months, their relationship continued to evolve in ways Daniel hadn't expected. He found himself spending more time with Lena outside of the office, getting to know her not just as a girl he had promised to help, but as a person, someone with dreams, with fears, with an entire world inside of her that had yet to be fully revealed. Lena, too, began to open up more. She had always carried the weight of her past like a heavy cloak, one she couldn't shed easily. But with Daniel's presence, with his quiet support, she slowly began to let go of some of the anger, the bitterness, the fear that had defined so much of her life. One day, as they sat on a bench in the park near Daniel's building, watching the sun dip below the horizon, Lena told him a story she had never shared with anyone before. "I used to have a dog," she said softly, her gaze fixed on the sky. "His name was Max. I found him on the streets when I was just a kid. He was this scruffy little mutt, all bones and fur, and he was so scared of everything. But we became inseparable. He was the only one who didn't judge me for being a homeless kid. He didn't care that I was dirty or hungry or alone. He just loved me. And I loved him. He was my family, my only family." Daniel listened, his chest tight as she spoke. He had never imagined that Lena's life had been so lonely, so full of hardship. He had assumed she had always been this fierce, independent person, but now he understood that her strength came from survival. "What happened to him?" Daniel asked quietly. "He was hit by a car," Lena said, her voice breaking just slightly. "I couldn't save him. I tried, but I couldn't. I couldn't protect him. And after that, I was alone. Really alone." Daniel's heart ached at her words, and for the first time, he allowed himself to imagine the kind of pain she had gone through, the kind of loss she had suffered. It was a pain he couldn't fully understand, but he wanted to. He wanted to be the person who could ease that hurt, even if just a little. "I'm sorry, Lena," he said, his voice gentle. "I can't imagine what that must have felt like." Lena shrugged, a small, rueful smile tugging at the corner of her lips. "It's not your fault. It's just, life. Life's like that sometimes." They sat in silence for a while, the city sounds around them blending into the background as they both contemplated the weight of their own thoughts. It was a rare moment of peace between them, a moment where the harsh realities of the world seemed to pause just long enough for them to breathe. As time went on, Daniel began to notice subtle shifts in his own life. He had always prided himself on his independence, on his ability to control every aspect of his world. But now, there was someone, he couldn't control. Lena had become a force in his life, and despite the fear that still gripped him at times, he couldn't deny that she had changed him. One afternoon, while reviewing contracts in his office, Daniel's phone buzzed. It was a text message from Lena. "Can I talk to you?" He smiled, despite himself. Over time, their conversations had become more natural, less guarded. He had become someone she could confide in, someone she trusted. Of course, he typed back. Come to my office. When Lena arrived, she was carrying something in her hand, a small, battered journal. She sat down across from him, her fingers tracing the worn leather cover, her eyes focused on it as though it held the answers to questions neither of them had asked. I've been thinking a lot, she began, her voice hesitant. About everything. About us. About what you said, that you'll try to be there for me. And I believe you. But I need to know something. Daniel set down the papers in front of him, his full attention now on her. What is it? Lena took a deep breath before speaking. What happens when I don't need you anymore? What happens when I can take care of myself? Will you still be here? The question hung in the air, and for a moment, Daniel was speechless. What could he say to that? Could he promise that he would always be there for her? That he would never let her go? I'll always be here, Lena, he said finally, his voice steady. No matter what. You don't ever have to worry about that. Her gaze softened, and for the first time, she smiled, a real smile, one that lit up her entire face. And in that moment, Daniel realized that their relationship was no longer just about him helping her. It was about them both learning to be better, to grow, and to understand that sometimes, the greatest gift you can give someone is not solutions or answers, but simply your presence. And perhaps that was the start of something more than either of them had expected, the unraveling and rebuilding. The months that followed were like a quiet storm, shifting the course of both their lives in ways neither Daniel nor Lena could have predicted. While the bond between them had grown stronger, a subtle undercurrent of tension began to develop as the world around them continued to change. Lena's walls were slowly coming down, but the deeper they connected, the more Daniel found himself confronting his own fears, his fears of inadequacy, of not being enough, of not knowing how to truly love someone when he had spent so many years running from that very idea. Lena, on the other hand, had begun to let herself trust again, but trust was a fragile thing for her. It was something she had never truly had, and each time she allowed herself to open up, it felt like walking a tightrope. She wanted so desperately to believe in the man who had become her protector, her lifeline. But part of her still couldn't shake the fear that he would leave her the moment things got difficult, just like everyone else in her life had. Their relationship, though undeniably stronger, was still untested. Neither of them had faced the real trials that would determine whether they could build something lasting together. And as much as Daniel tried to stay calm and patient, something inside him kept pushing him toward the inevitable questions. What if he wasn't cut out for this? What if, despite his best intentions, he couldn't fulfill the role she needed? What if his demons, the ones he had buried beneath years of ambition and control, would rise up and destroy everything? It wasn't until the phone call came that the gravity of their situation truly hit home. Daniel had just returned from a business trip when his assistant, Natalie, rushed into his office, her face pale. Mr. Ward, you need to take this call. It's Lena, she said, her voice tight with urgency. Daniel's heart skipped a beat, the only thought in his mind that something was wrong. He grabbed the phone from her, his pulse quickening as he heard her voice on the other end. Daniel, it's not good, Lena's voice cracked through the line, and for a brief moment, Daniel felt the world tilt beneath him. What happened? Are you okay? He could feel his heart racing, his mind already spiraling into worry. His first thought was of the dangers she had faced in her past, the rough streets, the constant threat of danger. Had something from that life come back to haunt her? I don't know how to say this, but I'm pregnant, Lena said, the words tumbling out in a rush. There was a pause, a silence that hung in the air before she spoke again. And I'm scared, Daniel. I don't know what to do. The room felt like it was closing in around him. Pregnant? Lena? Daniel felt as though he were standing at the edge of a cliff, staring into a vast unknown. His heart ached for her, but at the same time, his mind raced. He had no idea what to say, no idea how to process this new reality. He had spent his life avoiding commitments, burying emotions, building a fortress around himself. And now, it seemed like everything he had tried to control was unraveling in the most unexpected way. "I'll be there," he said, his voice steady despite the storm raging inside him. "Don't worry. We'll figure this out together. I'm not going anywhere." The next few days were a blur of emotions, decisions, and conversations neither Daniel nor Lena had ever imagined they would have to face. Daniel tried to remain calm and focused, but the weight of the situation settled heavily on his shoulders. What did it mean to be a father? What did it mean to be responsible for another life when he had barely learned to care for his own? Lena, on the other hand, was consumed by a mixture of fear and uncertainty. Her initial shock had given way to a sense of isolation that she couldn't shake. She had been abandoned so many times before, and though Daniel had promised he would be there for her, part of her couldn't help but wonder if this would be the point where he, too, would walk away. Late one night, as the city lights twinkled below Daniel's penthouse, they sat in the living room together. The silence was thick between them, and Lena stared at her hands, the uncertainty in her eyes palpable. "I didn't expect this," she said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. "I never thought I'd be here, in this place, with this future. I always thought I'd be alone. That I'd never get the chance to have the life that other people have. That I'd always be on the outside looking in." Daniel swallowed hard, his chest tight with emotion. He had always been the one who built his life with precision, with careful steps, controlling every aspect of his future. But this was beyond his control. He wasn't sure how to do this, how to be what she needed, how to be a father when he had no experience in being anything but the CEO of his company. "You're not alone," Daniel said quietly, the words feeling heavier than he expected. "I'm here. I'm not going anywhere, Lena. I'll be here for you. I'll be here for this baby. I never thought I'd be a father, but I'm willing to try. And I'll learn. I don't know how, but I'll learn." Lena's eyes glistened with unshed tears, and she looked away, as though afraid to let him see the vulnerability she couldn't hide anymore. "You don't have to do this, Daniel. You don't have to be with me out of obligation. I don't want you to feel like you have to." His heart clenched at the words. Was that what she thought? Did she think he was only here because he felt responsible, because he thought he had no other choice? "I'm not doing this out of obligation," Daniel said firmly. "I'm doing this because I want to. I care about you, Lena. And I care about this baby. I may not have all the answers, but I know one thing, I'm not going anywhere. I will figure it out, and I'll be the best father I can be. For you. For our child." Lena finally met his gaze, her expression softening just slightly. "You really mean that?" Daniel nodded, his voice steady but thick with emotion. "Yes, I do." In the weeks that followed, they began to make plans, the first steps toward a new life that neither of them had anticipated. It wasn't easy. There were moments of doubt, moments when both of them questioned whether they were truly capable of making this work. But through it all, Daniel remained by Lena's side, his promise to her unwavering. He wasn't perfect. Far from it. But for the first time, Daniel realized that being a father wasn't about being perfect, it was about showing up. It was about trying, no matter how hard it seemed. It was about being present, not just when things were good, but especially when they were hard. For Lena, the idea of a family was something she had long abandoned, something she never thought she would have. But now, as she watched Daniel try, as she saw him grapple with his own fears and uncertainties, she began to believe, perhaps for the first time in her life, that they could create something beautiful together. A family, imperfect but real. A family built on trust, on effort, on love. And maybe, just maybe, that was enough.